Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Jerry O'Brien. I am the editor for the Bulletin, Central Oregon's daily newspaper. I want to welcome you all to the Oregon Secretary of State's Forum. The forum is being presented by the Bulletin, EO Media Group, Pamplin Media Group, and Connect Central Oregon, a multimedia firm here in Bend. The program is being broadcast in real time on Facebook Live and on the newspaper sites for EO Media Group, which include the Daily Asturian, the Eastern Oregonian, the Blue Mountain Eagle, and the Hermiston Herald. Also, with Pamplin, the Portland Tribune is broadcasting this. It will also be available on Facebook and YouTube viewing following the forum. With us today are candidates Shemaiah Fagan, a Democrat, and Kim Thatcher, a Republican. This will be a 1-hour forum with opening statements and timed answers. So let's get right to it. Ms. Thatcher, you are up first with your 2-minute opening. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Ben Bulletin, Pamplin Media, EO Media Group, and everyone else listening in on the forum today. So in 2016, most of the papers across Oregon and voters chose Dennis Richardson for Secretary of State. Voters crossed party lines because they realized we need checks and balances in our government. They wanted someone who would conduct this office in a nonpartisan way. I think if he was here, he'd be sailing on to re-election. Unfortunately, he passed away last year. But there's only one candidate in this race right now who will carry on his legacy of accountability, transparency, and integrity in government. My opponent and I both served with Dennis, but I'm the only candidate who has the endorsement of Dennis's wife, Kathy. She knows I will carry on Dennis's mission of transparent government. I share the same fundamental belief that Oregon needs strong, steady, independent leadership, not more people who are bought by the governor or a handful of special interests. As our next Secretary of State, you can look at what I have done over the last 16 years in the legislature. You can see that I focused on government accountability and on many of the duties that focus and relate directly to the Secretary of State's office. You can count on me to run fair, honest elections. I'm a business owner for 28 years now, and I will count on the corporation division to help get Oregon back on track. I will continue working on more open and transparent public record system where people can have free access to the records that are there and hold government accountable. But most importantly, I'll continue to audit and use audits to shine a light on where government has failed its citizens and what we're doing well as well. I want to use the Secretary of State's office to help move families forward. I will continue Dennis's mission before he passed away. And if voters give me a chance this November, you will see.
Okay, thank you. Shemaiah?
Well, good afternoon. I am Shemaiah Fagan, and I am actually in the offices of the Bend Bulletin, so thank you for this space. I also want to, on this Indigenous Peoples Day, acknowledge that I am on the land of the traditional land of the Wasco, Warm Springs, and Paiute peoples. You know, I first became aware of politics and voting growing up in rural Oregon towns in Wasco County. My dad was a staunch Republican and a single parent raising 3 kids by himself. Our mom was in and out of our lives because she battled addiction and homelessness for most of my life. The summer before I started 2nd grade, my dad took us on a camping trip for a couple of weeks. I remember catching crawdads in the 8 Mile Creek at Dufur and sleeping in a big family tent. And many years later, my brothers told me what had really happened, that we had been evicted from our home in the Dalles and had nowhere to go. And it is because of those experiences that I've spent my career as both a civil rights attorney and an Oregon lawmaker, fighting for other families who are hanging on by a thread, passing things like paid sick leave and raising the minimum wage, and creating the Office of Small Business Assistance in the Secretary of State's office. Also, I've worked to expand our democracy from automatic voter registration to prepaid postage. But when I first announced my campaign for Secretary of State, I quickly learned that most people have no idea what this job is. And so I like to start there, that I see this role as one that makes sure that government is working for everybody, from running elections that are fair and secure, auditing state programs and revenues to make sure they're making a real difference in the lives of people who need them most, conducting our public records with accountability and transparency, running the Office of Small Business Assistance that I helped create my first term in the Oregon House. I will be a Secretary of State who makes sure that Oregon government works for everyday people.
Okay, Shamia, thank you very much. We're going to start with you with the first question, if you don't mind. President Trump has been very critical of vote by mail. In Oregon, vote by mail has been the way that we voted for such a long time. It has bipartisan support, including Secretary of State Bev Clarno, a Republican. Do you agree or disagree with President Trump's questions about vote by mail? If you do, why? If you don't, why not? Unmute.
I strongly disagree, and it's really not a matter of agreeing or disagreeing. He's flat out wrong, and he knows it. And he's spreading lies about vote by mail because, as his campaign manager acknowledged, he's afraid that if more people vote, he's not going to win an election. And the bottom line is, I've never voted any other way than vote by mail. I graduated from the Dallas High School in 1999, and our first vote by mail election statewide in Oregon was 1998. And our vote by mail system is incredibly secure. We have a forensic signature verification with an opportunity to cure if a signature doesn't match. We have a paper trail for every ballot. We have unique barcode tracking to make sure that folks vote and only vote once. And we don't have internet access to any of our counting machines, so those don't have to worry about hacking. Sadly, I've been the only candidate in this race willing to say unequivocally that claims of widespread voter fraud, whether in Oregon or anywhere else, are a myth. And they're a myth spread by people who simply want to make it harder for certain people to vote. My opponent 4 years ago called vote by mail plagued here in Oregon. I have never said that. I have celebrated it as a safe, accessible way to vote both when there's a pandemic and when there is not a pandemic. And I think that other states would be smart to follow Oregon's lead. And for those other states, I'm very sorry that the president is making that harder.
Okay. Kim?
Thank you. Yes, Oregonians love vote by mail. I love vote by mail. We have a really good system in place. I do think it is also very important to realize that nothing is perfect, and we do need to give it a top to bottom check just to ensure that we are presenting the best processes that we have out there. Now, as far as my opponent putting words in my mouth saying that I'm, against vote by mail in some way, it's just simply not true. In fact, when she says that I was looking at vote by mail as plagued, we were looking at a situation in time where there were some problems. There were some ballots going out wrongly to people, and then they had to send out ballots again, and there was just kind of a fiasco going on. So that was a snapshot in time, and yeah, there was a little bit of a problem. So vote by mail is something that we can always continue to improve. I want to do that. I want to give our system a top to bottom look, including registering to vote to counting the last ballot. I think that is always in the best interest of Oregon voters to make sure that we have the best processes in place and always reevaluating and looking to make sure things are always improving.
Okay, Kim, and just to follow up on that, this is the second question. Should what is sometimes called ballot harvesting be legal in Oregon? Are there additional changes that Oregon should be making to make it easier for Oregonians to vote? And what changes might that be?
Well, thank you for that question. I think just a couple of years ago, because of ballot harvesting going on, some people's ballots didn't get turned in. And I think that can be a problem. I don't really, ballot harvesting is one thing, but right now in Oregon, we've got to improve how we inform our voters. We need to make sure that the people who are not being able to vote, not able to receive their ballots in the mail because of the wildfires, that they're given this information on how they actually can get out and vote without having to work and get a hold of it and make sure that there's, make sure that information is out there for them. We need to also be looking at when you say changes, what changes would I make? I would make sure that we are making, you know, there's some counties out there that can't afford to put out a ballot voters pamphlet statement, and maybe that would be something the Secretary of State's office should look at paying for, so people can have that information and have correct information before they go to vote and choose a candidate that there's no information on. So I think those are things that we can do, and ballot harvesting is something that I think we should look at. A lot of states have outlawed it, and it can be a problem because people's votes can get thrown in the trash.
Okay. Shamia?
Ballot harvesting isn't a thing. People can collect other people's ballots, which is a critical part of having a safe and accessible vote by mail system. They can help them turn in their ballots for folks who have limited mobility, for folks in rural areas who maybe don't have as reliable of mail service, and take those to a drop box. For some folks in more geographically spread out counties, sometimes those ballot drop boxes can be a ways away. So ballot harvesting is a term that is used by the president and his allies, again, to try to criticize vote by mail. In fact, if you ask what the president has said about ballot harvesting, he said there are literally people standing at the end of streets and people stealing ballots out of people's mailboxes and bringing them to someone at the end of street, which of course he has no evidence to back up because that didn't happen. Here in Oregon, we do allow people to help other people get their in and collect those ballots. And if anybody accidentally, even accidentally, doesn't turn in someone else's ballot, there is and should be a severe fine. And Senator Thatcher referenced about 100 or so ballots that were collected a few years ago, and unintentionally, but it was an absolutely critical mistake that these organizations did not turn in those ballots. They were fined by the Secretary of State, and they absolutely should have been. So let's not create a solution when there is not a problem. Ballot collection is real. Ballot harvesting is not a thing.
Okay. So back to you, Shamia, on this. This is the third question. Would you use your office to advocate for open primaries in Oregon?
I've advocated for open primaries when I've been, before I've been running for Secretary of State and after. Now, this is something that each party gets to decide, because under the First Amendment, the free association clause of the First Amendment, is the Republican and Democratic parties and other parties in our state that get to decide whether or not they have an open primary. And this is a place where I have disagreed with some folks in my own party. I do believe that there should be an open primary, that folks who are non-affiliated voters, which is basically the second largest voting group in Oregon, are non-affiliated voters, that they should be able to vote in primaries to help select those folks who ultimately go on to the general election. I've been very clear about that before running for the Secretary of State's office and during.
Okay, over to you, Kim.
So open primaries, there are different ways of having open primaries. There's different levels of openness. Having been nominated by the Independent Party of Oregon, and the fact that they allowed non-affiliated voters to go ahead and vote in their primary, I think that is a great way to go. I wish parties would do that. The Independent Party did. They invited them to participate. I wish the Republican Party had decided to do that as well. I don't know why it didn't happen. I wish they had. That is something I would advocate for, especially for the non-affiliated voters that just feel disenfranchised. They don't feel like they want to have that party moniker stuck on them. They just want to be able to participate fully and not have to sign up for one team or the other. They just want to be independent and non-affiliated. And that's something that I would definitely be in support of.
All right, well, thank you. So Kim, does Oregon need a new way of doing redistricting that removes politicians from drawing the boundaries? Would you use your position to try to advocate for such a change?
Absolutely. From the very beginning, I have supported what was in Initiative Petition 57, having to do with an independent redistricting process. And I said that I would adhere to that as well as I could. Obviously, I can't draw congressional lines. Should that ballot measure not make it to the ballot? Well, it didn't. It didn't make it to the ballot. And because of that, that's what I've pledged to do as Secretary of State should redistricting make it to my level. Now it's kind of funny because on the other hand, my opponent did not support independent redistricting or any such thing. She says the system's not broke, don't fix it. It's only lately that she's decided she wants to have a people's commission or some such. And not only that, I don't see that as very nonpartisan because she just recently received, I don't know, I think $100,000 from the National Democratic Redistricting Committee. That just doesn't sound very nonpartisan to me, or looking at a fair way, an independent way of redistricting. And that is what I support, and that is what I will do. I will put in place an independent commission, much as what is spelled out in the initiative petition that failed to make it to the ballot.
Okay, Shamia.
Thank you.
To respond?
Yes, I do support amending the Oregon Constitution. Right now, Article 4, Section 6 of the Oregon Constitution requires that the legislature perform the redistricting function unless it can't do that by July 1st. And after July 1st, it would go to the Secretary of State, who would be responsible for that. Now, in terms of politicians drawing their own boundaries, let's just be clear in one thing. Senator Thatcher is the only person in this race who's ever actually voted yes on the lines that make up her very, very safe Republican district that she has served in, both in the House and the Senate. She voted yes in 2011 to draw her own district, and didn't take a stand at that time, but is now saying that she's taking a stand now that she's running for Secretary of State. So I want to acknowledge that when we're talking about redistricting, we're talking about the census. And I do think it's important that we acknowledge that when our country was first founded, in our first census, not even every person was counted as a full human being with a 3/5 clause. We as a state, when we were founded, we actually excluded previously enslaved African-American people from living in our state. And so what I didn't support in IP 57 was the fact that it is a model after California that has failed to meet those diversity and equity goals. But IP 57 is not on the ballot because they failed to qualify for the requisite number of signatures. And so I'm very much in support of a People's Commission that I would eventually want to put in the Oregon Constitution and amend that Constitution, which is essentially an independent commission, but that is rooted in justice and racial equity.
All righty. And Shamia, this is question number 5 for you. Do any changes need to be made to Oregon's laws or Secretary of State procedures to make it easier to get initiatives on the ballot? Would you use your position to advocate for such changes?
Well, the threshold for our initiative and referendum system has been in the Oregon Constitution for 100 years. So it's Article 4, Section 1 of the Constitution, which lays out how many signatures have to be collected if it's a referendum, 4% of the total votes in the previous governor's election. If it's an initiative, 6% of the total votes in the previous governor's election. And if it's a constitutional amendment, 8% of the total votes of the previous governor's election. So those are set in the Oregon Constitution. But I do think that this pandemic has certainly showed a way in which folks that were trying to gather signatures, now 2 initiative petitions that were grassroots petitions by folks did qualify for the ballot. And so it certainly was not a prohibitive function. But I think that this pandemic certainly showed that it can be difficult when there are situations. But we need to make sure that if we do make it easier for folks, that we don't also create opportunities for folks to do that in a way that is fraudulent, which is what was happening with e-sheets back in prior to a few years ago, is folks were just printing out a stack of e-sheets and not actually printing out the actual measure that folks were voting on. And then people were taking stacks of those and sticking them at various places where they thought somebody might want to sign their petition. When a signature petition circulator, to have valid signatures on their clipboard, they have to always carry the actual measure with them, not just a summary as is printed on the e-sheet. So I think it's important that we don't allow large loopholes that allow fraud to come into our very strong initiative and referendum system.
Okay. And Kim?
Yes, I would have to work with the legislature because the legislature has done much lately to undo and make it much more difficult for citizen initiatives to make it to the ballot. That would include reducing the ability of the e-sheets that had a high rate of validity in the signatures, and also getting rid of the emergency clause in some fashion or another. So there's not this jaded attempt to try to bypass the will of the voters and keep them from keeping their legislature accountable through the referendum. Use of that emergency clause blocks that off. And the signature requirement for referendums is much lower than what it is for having to go through and get an initiative on. And then by the time the initiative makes it to the ballot, the train has left the station. So the access to the right to referendum in a actual positive, intentional way is very important. And we need to work with the legislature, or possibly if the citizens can actually get an initiative on the ballot now, with some of the difficulties that have been created by the legislature, maybe they can do that change. But yes, we definitely need to make it a more people-driven process again.
All righty. And Kim, for you, are there any changes you would advocate to ensure action is taken on the findings found in the Secretary of State's audits?
Absolutely. I've been promoting that since I've been in the legislature. And finally, just in the past couple of years, there is more of a connection between what the auditors find and the agencies being audited, that there's accountability. The recommendations from the auditors are being taken up and committed to by the agencies with a timeline. But I also think that it's important for the auditors to follow up and see how these things are being adhered to. In the past, the good work of auditors would just sit on a shelf collecting dust, and nothing would ever come of it necessarily from improving government. But that's so important that we connect that work and improve the agencies. We need to be looking at what the truth is of something and make recommendations and then fix the problem. That's the process that should be taking place here.
All right, thank you. Sorry, Shamia.
Thank you. I think the answer is yes, but I want to back up and acknowledge why this is so important. The Oregon Employment Department has failed to get out checks and the benefits and essentially the make-up paychecks that Oregonians have needed for thousands and thousands of families. And I want to be very clear, that is unacceptable. And in response to your question, there were previous audits of the Oregon Employment Department with recommendations that could have prevented this atrocity from happening. And so that's why it's important. It's a real life example of real people who are harmed when public services don't work. I see audits as the best tool the Secretary of State has to make sure that our policies reflect Oregon values. And the Oregon Employment Department is the first place that I have agreed that I will do an audit, because you have to find out what went wrong, how do we fix it, and how do we make sure it never happens again. And that includes going back to those previous audits and doing an audit of essentially what happened after those recommendations came out, what happened after those audits came out, so we can make sure that these Oregon families are never left behind again. I was proud to be the only one of the two of us who voted in favor of an eviction moratorium on people's rent, a foreclosure moratorium for people's homes during this pandemic. But the reality is there's no moratorium on paying your groceries or paying the babysitter or getting your prescription medication. So I think it's very, very important that we go back and find out what went wrong and how do we fix it and make sure it never happens again.
Okay, well, thank you. We're going to take a short little break here and do a promotional piece for EO Media and Pamplin Group. And I want to remind the viewers too, if they are on Facebook Live right now, that they can submit questions to the Secretary of State candidates if they wish to.
We are local newspapers.
To the voiceless,
and hold government entities to a high standard.
We support the communities that support us.
Encourage economic vitality.
And open up dialogue on important issues.
we make people laugh.
And sometimes make people cry.
And inspire people to get involved.
We introduce you to new people, places, and businesses.
And honor our community's unique history.
We have opinions based on our research.
And we label them as such.
Newspapers are the glue that holds a community together.
We're your neighbors. And we care about our communities, just like you do.
We are EO Media Group. Local journalism, locally owned.
All righty, and we're back. Okay, well, welcome back, folks. Shamia, this question will be for you to start off with. What level of independence should the office of Oregon's Public Records Advocate have? Should it be located within the Secretary of State's office or some other agency?
Well, I think that it should be independent in the Secretary of State's office. This was the recommendation of the Public Records Advisory Committee that put forth recommendations after Ginger McCall, of course, told her story. And this is actually a bill that passed unanimously in the Senate in the 2019 legislative session. I was very happy to support it, but then didn't actually end up becoming law, which of course, much to the pain of Oregonians, because the Republicans, including Senator Thatcher, walked out and shut down the legislative session. And so we were not able to actually follow through with these ideas that were good ideas and that would benefit Oregonians. But I think it's very, very important that a public records advocate is independent and independent from any forces that would cause her to not want to be on the side of the folks seeking the records. Essentially, this advocate is an ombudsman. They're the person that's in there fighting for the person seeking the public records to make sure that process is inexpensive and efficient and accurate. And I would very much support the independence, as I already did in February, and would look forward to introducing a bill to do just that as Oregon's next Secretary of State.
All right, Kim?
Well, thank you for that. Yes, I am the first senator to serve on the Public Records Advisory Council. I've served on it from the beginning. Yes, it was my bill that would bring independence to that office, because there was a little bit of a conflict there that occurred with the first advocate. And yes, that did not make it to the House vote, because that's all it needed. I carried it on the floor and to be independent, and it didn't make it through the House floor because we had to leave over the cap and trade bill. And the cap and trade bill, oddly, supported by my opponent, had a big secrecy clause in it so that not even legislators would be able to scrutinize some of the inner workings of this program. And so that's where we might differ on public records. I want to put more public records online and give people that free access so that they can scrutinize their government. I've been a proponent of that from the beginning. It's a little easier said than done, however, but other states have managed to do it, and I think Oregon can too. And as far as bringing forward the transparency website is something I brought forward in 2009 that put the state's checkbook online and public meetings and a whole bunch of other information. So I've been a long time proponent of public records access and making it easier for folks.
Okay, well, thank you very much. And Kim, back to you on this one. What is your take on Measure 107 to amend the Constitution regarding campaign finance laws? This allows laws limiting political campaign contributions and expenditures, requiring disclosure of political campaign contributions and expenditures. Measure 107.
Thank you. Yes, 107, I am a proponent. I sent it to the ballot. I was one of the people that voted yes to send it to the ballot as a legislative referral. I have a statement in my voters pamphlet, in the voters pamphlet, in support of Measure 107, especially when it comes to transparency and not creating fake groups to look like they're in the tank for one candidate, or look like they're supporting and neutral all candidates and just are evaluating unobjectively who is the best candidate. My opponent was a recipient of such antics that her own party called something like clickbait and things, deceptive and things like that. And yes, I think we should have some limits in our campaign spending. My opponent has received nearly $1 million from just a handful of special interests. And I I don't know what that number should be, but I would convene a multi-partisan citizens group to be able to get these different perspectives from the different groups on what should happen. What has happened at times, if it's not done right, campaign contribution limits can disadvantage challengers to the incumbents, and it can, if we're not careful, disadvantage the minor third party folks. So we need to make sure that we're approaching this in an even-handed way and not disadvantaging one group or another.
Okay, thank you. Shamia?
Well, I first saw what you call Measure 107 when it was called SJR, or Senate Joint Resolution 18, and I was very proud to vote to send that to the ballot. Oregonians might be wondering, why do we need to vote on this? But we actually need to amend the Oregon Constitution to allow campaign finance limits. Oregonians, we used to have campaign finance limits, but then a court case in the 90s from the Oregon Supreme Court ruled that campaign finance limits violated Oregon's Constitution. So it's very important for folks watching this from all across the political spectrum to please vote yes on Measure 107 so that it's in the Constitution, and then the legislature or the people through the initiative can actually enact campaign finance reform, which is sorely needed here in Oregon. And I think it's very important that we acknowledge that we need to be guided by some principles. One is that campaigns need to be able to raise enough money to pay their staff a living wage and provide health insurance. I'm very proud to do that. I don't rely on unpaid internships. I believe people are going to do work for my campaign. They should be compensated. And I also think it's important that we recognize that $1 from 1 million people is not the same as $1 million from one person. I'm very proud, for example, to be supported by the United Food and Commercial Workers Union. These are folks that are checking us out at Safeway and Fred Meyer, and of their, something like almost 30,000 members, 8,500 of them, 8,500 voluntarily donate $1 a week. And the question is, these are the kind of folks that you think have too much power. A checkout worker at Fred Meyer who donates $1 a week and then collectively pools their money to support candidates who they know support working people's values.
Okay, well, thank you. So this is regarding the Secretary of State's office in general. And Shamir, we'll start with you. Tradition dictates that the Secretary of State's office is a stepping stone to the governorship. Is that your intention for running for this office?
Well, I won't need a minute and a half to answer that one. No, I have no plans to run for governor in 2022.
All right. Kim.
I absolutely have no intention of running for governor in 2022, especially if I am elected to be the Secretary of State. I am looking forward to serving in that role and working on the many things that I've actually been preparing for years to do, because I've been focusing on many of the duties that relate directly to the Secretary of State's office. That includes dealing with the corporation division, the small business advocate, dealing with elections issues, as well as public records issues. I've served on the land board. Those all play into serving as a good Secretary of State. Plus, I started my own business 28 years ago, and I manage lots of people and lots of moving parts, and that will bode well for managing the office of the Secretary of State. And that is what I look forward to doing, and I hope that I get the nod from voters to go ahead and continue on in the legacy of Secretary of State Dennis Richardson.
Okay, and these next couple of questions are a little deeper dive into that, but for Kim, should the Secretary of State's office be a partisan position? Would you use your position to advocate for such a change one way or the other?
I think the Secretary of State has nonpartisan, or what should be nonpartisan duties. It's mostly a managerial and administrative sort of position. And absolutely, if that's something the legislature would like to do, is change that to being a nonpartisan position, I'd be all for it. But regardless of it being a partisan or nonpartisan position right now, that's how I want to approach the office of the Secretary of State. And that is as a nonpartisan, unlike my opponent, who is accepting money from the National Democratic Redistricting Committee. I don't think that she'll be looking at redistricting with an eye of independence and accepting all kinds of money from the governor and many of the government union bosses. These people who have put money into this, into the unions, are not purposely donating to Shemia Fagan for Secretary of State. I have 99% of my donations are coming from local Oregonians. And that is the kind of independence and widespread support that we need to see in the Secretary of State's office. I would support the position being nonpartisan, absolutely.
All right, Shemia?
Jerry, you mind repeating the question? I kind of lost track of what the question was.
I know it's, should the Secretary of State's office be a partisan position? Would you use your position to advocate for such a change?
Well, the answer is no, it shouldn't be a partisan position. And that's regardless of whether or not a Republican or a Democrat is serving. Right now, our only statewide position that is you run without your party affiliation on the actual ballot is the Bureau of Labor and Industries, and yet a Democrat still holds that position. So the idea that making it nonpartisan, actually, in the end, ultimately, it's what your values are. And I think it's important for Oregonians to know what the Secretary of State's values are. I will note that because the Secretary of State under the Oregon Constitution is also Oregon's Lieutenant Governor, I do think that all issues, whether or not they directly relate to the Secretary of State's office or not, are relevant to Oregonians making their decision. And I just want to acknowledge one thing that my colleague, Senator Thatcher, said, that I've been endorsed by the National Democratic Redistricting Commission, which is the group set up by President Obama and Attorney General Holder, whose core mission is to end partisan gerrymandering. And I would add that on one of the videos on Senator Thatcher's Facebook page, when she's talking about being in support of an independent commission, she specifically cites the Obama Holder organization. So she clearly sought that endorsement, and maybe there's some sour grapes over the fact that I actually got the endorsement because they trust me to fulfill their core mission, which is to end partisan gerrymandering.
Okay, and again, I know we're might be harping on this a little bit much, but here's a kind of another spin on that question. And this is for Shemia first. Currently, the Secretary of State's office is the only statewide political position held by a Republican. Is it important that the office remains with the party other than the one that holds all the other statewide offices? For Shemia, why not?
Well, I don't think any political party, the Republican Party, the Democratic Party, any party, is owed a position in Oregon State's government, particularly one that oversees Oregon's elections. It's actually Oregonians who are owed and who are entitled to a fair debate on the issues and contrast between the candidates. And this is a position where Senator Thatcher and I disagree. I actually don't think that voting rights and making sure that government works for everybody, I don't think those should be partisan issues. In fact, I support voting rights, and I'm not because I'm a Democrat, but because I'm pro-democracy. That's why I supported automatic voter registration that Senator Thatcher voted against. That's why I worked with Republicans to pass national popular vote so that a Republican in Oregon's vote matters just as much as a Republican in Ohio or Michigan or Florida. That's why I worked to make it easier for Oregonians to mail their ballots by putting prepaid postage on their ballots, which again, Senator Thatcher, all three of those expansions of our democracy, she voted against. So I don't know if she voted against them because she simply opposes expanding our democracy or because she's a Republican or both. But I actually don't think these should be partisan issues. And I certainly welcome the days of the Oregonians like Mark Hatfield and Tom McCall. I'm currently rereading Mark Hatfield's autobiography. I'm almost done. I have 2 chapters left. But in the end, it's about your values and whether you share values with Oregonians.
All right. And Kim?
I think your question was something to do with a Republican now holds the position.
Yes.
And what was the rest of it?
Okay. So, and it's one of the only positions a Republican holds in state government. Is it important that the office remains with the party, the Republican Party, other than the one that holds all the other statewide offices? Why is that important?
Well, I think it's important to have checks and balances in our government. It's a little easier if you're outside the club that's running things right now, but I don't think it has to be that way. I think there were some really good candidates during the Democratic primary who would have done a very fair and nonpartisan job of running the Secretary of State's office and getting to the bottom of audits and making sure that we do have fair and accountable elections, and expanding motor voter to not give people the choice to choose to register, but instead government's making that choice for them. And then maybe putting people's information onto a public database that they didn't ask for, not funding and having a good way of funding and continuing to fund stamps on the envelopes before people, so people don't have to pay to mail their ballots in. There's more to it, more to those topics than just, it's expanding voter access, because I don't think that's necessarily been proven. I think our voter participation rates haven't been shown to increase over time, but because of those measures. But the thing is, there's a lot of things that are done in government and needs to be done through the Secretary of State's office with an eye of nonpartisanship and objectivity and holding government accountable.
Okay, and we have one question from the audience. It's for Kim, but I think you can both probably comment on this. According to this reader, Ms. Thatcher won't tell us who she's voting for because she says it's inappropriate for the Secretary of State candidate to comment on any candidate on the ballot. However, the endorsement of Bev Clarno, our current Secretary of State, is prominently featured on Kim's voting pamphlet. Why is it appropriate for our sitting Secretary of State to comment on an election, and what's the difference?
No, I don't think it's appropriate for a Secretary of State candidate or a sitting Secretary of State to comment on candidates or ballot measures that have nothing to do with the Secretary of State's office. Now, me being a candidate for Secretary of State relates directly to the Secretary of State's office. And Bev Clarno, the sitting Secretary of State, decided to weigh in saying, yeah, I should be her replacement. So having said that, there are important reasons why I don't think it's appropriate to weigh in on candidates or issues that have nothing to do with the Secretary of State's office. And that's because the Oregon Secretary of State is the referee, if you will, of Oregon elections. How fair would you feel it was if you were playing on a team and the referee was out there, wearing the jersey of one of the team members, one of the teams out there? I just don't think that people would feel like they're being treated very fair. They may be rooting for somebody internally, but they shouldn't be making a show of it. And there should be some semblance of fairness being shown and extended. I don't think it's appropriate to weigh in on things that don't have anything to do with the Secretary of State's office.
Okay, and Shamia, do you want to comment on that?
I will certainly comment. I think that she just said the Secretary of State is the referee, and yet she proudly showed the referee's endorsement in her voters pamphlet. I just want to make sure that folks didn't miss that. Again, information furnished by Kim Thatcher in her voters pamphlet. But ultimately, I trust Bev Clarno. I don't have any concerns about this election. Most importantly, I trust Oregon law and I trust Oregon vote by mail. But this is another place where Senator Thatcher and I disagree. Look, I grew up in Wasco County in a house full of Republicans. My brothers work as a diesel mechanic in Umatilla County in Hermiston. My other is a welder in Pendleton. You're not always going to like where I stand, but you will always know where I stand. I'm supporting Joe Biden and Kamala Harris. But the difference between me and Senator Thatcher is twofold. Number one, I'm willing to be straight with you. All of you, even folks that maybe disagree with me, where she will go to rallies for President Trump. She'll go to cruises for President Trump. She'll stand on a stage in front of a banner that says Trump 2020. She'll stand on stage with candidates who are only running on the Republican ticket, including candidates who have been known for supporting the QAnon conspiracy theory, which is incredibly dangerous. And yet she says that she doesn't know. And so I think the bottom line is she's signaling one thing to her base and she's signaling something else to us. The fact is, who the president of the United States is does matter to Oregon voters, and it does matter to the Secretary of State's office. He's out there making false claims about vote by mail. He's in charge of overseeing the census data, which will inform redistricting. So I'll always be straight with you, even if you don't like what I have to say.
All right. So we've come to the part of the debate where each of the candidates get to ask the other a question. And we're going to start with Shemia. You can ask him a question.
Oh, Jerry, on my end, you just froze. Did he freeze for anybody else?
Yeah, you're unfrozen, it looks like.
Okay. So can you repeat the question?
Yes. So you each get a chance to ask the other a question of each other. So and then you have 90 seconds to respond.
Okay.
And you can go first, Shemia.
Thank you. Kim, you have touted your experience as a business owner and using slogans such as honesty, transparency, and accountability. But you continue to dodge questions about the $63,000 fine your company was ordered to pay to the state of Oregon after an Oregon judge investigated your company for contracting fraud against the state. And the judge ruled that your company, quote, engaged in a cover-up with a willingness to deceive. The judge's words, not mine, including making up fake invoices and intentionally destroying evidence. And if I have misstated any facts, please do let me know. My question is, how can Oregonians trust you to not deceive them again?
So when will you quit beating your wife question? All right. So yes, my company did have a contract dispute on an ODOT project. ODOT was the defendant, went through a process, and my company eventually settled. And part of that settlement was to pay some of the fees for defending. And that is what the $63,000 was. It had a whole bunch of things in there, had an accountant, it had some attorney fees. It was nothing compared to what they were asking for. But having said that, it was because of that experience right there that I said, we have got to get a small business advocate. We need to get a business ombudsman, is the word that was used at the time, to help businesses get through some of this bureaucratic nonsense that exists out there. And it was because of that I passed that bill in 2011, 2 years before you were even in there, Shemia, but then it got finished up in 2013. I appreciate you signing on to that and putting it in the Secretary of State's office. That is great. It's a great place for it. Because if that advocate had been in place, I know that we wouldn't be even sitting here talking about it. So yes, there were allegations, doesn't mean that they were true. Because if they were true, I would not be sitting here and I would not have still been doing business on ODOT projects all these years.
All righty. And so you have a chance now to ask Shemia a question.
All right. Shemia, you have a history now of voting to overturn the will of the people on issues your special interest donors want. 2 examples from the recent session were your votes to change how the death penalty is factored and to change Measure 11 sentencing for juveniles. The result of your votes is that the Max train killer was not eligible for the death penalty, and a juvenile murderer the judge said was a sadistic killer will be out of prison in 7 years. So even if you don't agree with voters on these issues, why wouldn't you allow them the right to vote again on these issues? Do you think you know better than they do?
Oregonians voted to reinstate the death penalty, I believe, several decades ago, and that hasn't changed. Oregonians gave the legislature the ability to define aggravated murder, and the legislature did that. The reality is, in terms of a good government measure, this is a measure that there's been a moratorium in the last 2 governors of executing anybody. And yet somebody who is charged with a crime and that will be potentially sentenced to death gets an extraordinarily more money spent on their defense, even though the outcome for them is ultimately the same, because the governor, this governor and the previous governor have not been willing to execute anybody. But I think this is a good example of a place that you and I disagree. You know, I believe that we should have passed the Measure 11, which is juvenile justice, which actually was supported by your late colleague and my late colleague, Senator Jackie Winters, recognizing that young people people who commit crimes at a time that they are 15 or 16 or 17, that we should give them a second look. In fact, President Trump actually passed criminal justice reform that was very similar to what we did here in Oregon. But the bottom line is Measure 11, which is put into place by the voters, is still in effect, and to tell them differently is a lie. And the death penalty, which voters put into place, is also still in effect. So to tell them otherwise is also a lie.
Alrighty, and we're going to take one more question from a reader, and then we'll move on to closing statements. This is actually for Senator Thatcher, but I'm sure you can both comment on this. It says, Senator Thatcher, you walked off the job multiple times now. Would you walk out of the Secretary of State's job if things don't go your way?
Well, thank you for that question. And, you know, as a legislator who had nothing to gain, because this is the kind of thing that's said, who had nothing to gain except to protect the voters' ability to have their voices heard when there's an issue that's much bigger than the legislature, would be affecting every man, woman, and child in this state, and would have a secrecy clause in it. There were many reasons to stand up for Oregon voters and make sure that they had their voices be able to be heard, and that just wasn't going to happen. And had they just removed the emergency clauses on some of these things that are thrown out there, I don't think you would have seen, or we wouldn't have even been talking about this issue right now. And just kind of going back to what was said earlier about Trump rallies and all that, you know, I show up where I'm asked to go and promote my candidacy. I am promoting my candidacy now, and I am appearing with my opponent. It doesn't mean I'm endorsing her. So moving on from that, and as far as it being a lie of talking about the voters' will being overturned, redefining something so you can get by with it is definitely going around the voters. Changing the Measure 11 definitions is also going around voters. They should have had a chance to weigh in.
Okay, thank you. Shamia, would you like to respond?
Sure. What Senator Thatcher is not telling you is that the bill that she walked out to stop in May of 2019 was the Student Success Act, which was a collaboration after 2 years of driving around and looking at all the different schools in all 36 counties in our state and finding out what schools needed with respect to early childhood education to make kids succeed more, mental health in our schools. That's the bill she walked out to prevent from passing. And the Republicans wouldn't come back until the Democrats ended a proposal for safe gun storage and public health requirements around vaccines. So those are the bills she came back for. But the bottom line is, I think it's interesting that she had said she had nothing to gain, because she certainly gained by appearing on Fox News, a national cable network, to talk about the walkout. And most importantly, she gained at your expense, because she continued to pull a paycheck from you as taxpayers, including the per diem that legislators are paid every day they're in the session, continued to get paid while not showing up for work. And the Oregon State Police was actually sent out to try to find legislators to bring them back. So it's hard to imagine somebody running on accountability when they were literally hiding from the state police so they didn't have to come back to the Capitol and do the job for which you as Oregonians were paying her to do.
All right, thank you. Well, this has been a full hour of questions and answers and interesting topics. Shamia, you will have 2 minutes now for a closing statement, and then Kim, we will go to you for 2 minutes.
Well, thank you for this opportunity. Elections are about choices. And I think you've seen that Oregonians have a clear choice this November between one candidate who has voted with her party to restrict voting access and a candidate who's led the fights to expand your access to the ballot. One candidate who's been silent when misinformation and conspiracy theories threaten public health and our democracy, and one candidate who tells the truth. One candidate propped up by extreme right-wing organizations, and a candidate trusted and endorsed by the very people that you have trusted for decades. I'm very proud to be endorsed by the Oregon League of Conservation Voters, which are grassroots folks dedicated to protecting our clean air and clean water and mitigating the devastating impacts of climate change on our forests. the American Postal Workers Union, the workers who have been delivering our paychecks and birthday cards and sustaining medications and our ballots for decades here in Oregon. I'm proud to be endorsed by U.S. Senators Jeff Merkley and Ron Wyden, two men that we've been proud to send to the United States Senate to represent Oregon. I'm proud to be endorsed by Planned Parenthood PAC, a group of grassroots organizers making sure that freedom includes reproductive freedom. I'm so proud to be endorsed by the Oregon State Firefighters Council, Oregon teachers, the SEIU, Oregon nurses, and so many other heroes on the front line serving Oregon families today and every day. But I'm not done, not until I can add you to that list. My name is Shemia Fagan, and I'm asking for your vote this November or this October, whenever your family sits down to safely vote from home here in Oregon.
Okay, thank you. And Kim?
4 years ago, Oregonians chose Republican Dennis Richardson to be their Secretary of State. Why? Because after years of fiascos like Cover Oregon, the Columbia River Bridge to Nowhere, and a $1 billion scam from the business energy tax credit, they knew they needed a watchdog in state government and not a lapdog to government union bosses and special interests. This election, people need a Secretary of State also not beholden to the governor. My commitment is to use this office to help Oregon families get back on track. And we do that by ensuring fair and transparent elections. We do that by having a fair and transparent redistricting process that benefits people and not politicians. We do that by taking on the biggest challenges Oregon is facing right now. Kids are home from school. There's endless emergency orders from the governor. There's riots in the street and wildfires that have displaced thousands. We take these problems, we audit for the truth, and we use those audits to hold government accountable and make the needed reforms. Is our $9 billion education budget helping students succeed? Heck, there are families right now that can't even log into the internet. This education gap is leaving thousands of our children behind. And unlike my opponent, I haven't taken 6-digit dollars from the education unions, the ones who don't want people to know how badly schools are failing kids and don't want to have parents have choices for educating their kids. So along with that, why are there still thousands of unemployed Oregonians who have yet to receive their benefits? We've got to understand that and fix it so it never happens again. I am proud that 99% of the donations I have received have come from local Oregonians. I'm the only one in this race who has a coalition of people from left, right, and middle who are ready for change. And unlike my opponent, I am not beholden to the governor or her special interests. If you want to help get Oregon back on track and back onto the path that Dennis Richardson was taking us on, then I ask for your vote this November because we all deserve better.
All right. Well, thank you. And thank you both for participating in this forum. I very much appreciate it. And I think it's a very important position in the state government, and voters need to be made aware of making a clear choice for Secretary of State. Thank you to Shemia Fagan, the Democrat running for this office, and to Kim Thatcher, the Republican running for this office. And I also want to thank EO Media Group and Pamplin Media Group for co-hosting this, as well as Connect Central Oregon Multimedia Group here in Bend. They did a fantastic job. Thank you to all. And you can watch this forum on our Facebook site and on YouTube after a few minutes after this is completed. Take care.
Thanks, Jerry.
We are local newspapers in print
and online, on our websites and on our news apps.
We protect democracy
by asking the tough questions
and holding those in authority accountable.
We give a voice to the voiceless
and hold government entities to a high standard.
We support the communities that support us.
Encourage economic vitality.
And open up dialogue on important issues.
We make people laugh.
And sometimes make people cry.
And inspire people to get involved.
We introduce you to new people, places, and businesses.
And honor our community's unique history.
We have opinions based on our research.
And we label them as such.
Newspapers are the glue that holds a community together.
We're your neighbors.
And we care about our communities, just like you do.
We are EO Media Group, local journalism, locally owned.